Here is your top story for January 4th, 2026. Marco Rubio says he believes Cuba is in a lot of trouble. Source: NBC News. After a U.S. military operation that led to the capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Secretary of State Marco Rubio warned that Cuba is in a lot of trouble. He reiterated that warning on NBC News Meet the Press, saying he believes Cuba is in serious trouble. The remarks came just one day after the operation. Here is your top story for January 5, 2026. U.S. plans to intercept tanker involved in Venezuelan oil trade days after Maduro's capture. Source: CBS News. The United States plans to intercept an evading tanker that has long carried Venezuelan crude and is subject to Treasury Department sanctions. Two U.S. officials say Venezuelan officials discussed arming those tankers with Soviet-era defense systems and armed personnel, while disguising them as civilian ships to defend the shipments. CBS News notes, the move comes days after Maduro's capture, highlighting ongoing U.S. pressure over Venezuela's oil trade. Here is your top story for January 6th, 2026. Minneapolis Mayor: Trump sowing chaos with massive ICE operation. Source: CNN. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey told CNN's Erin Burnett that the Trump administration's plan to deploy about 2,000 federal agents to Minnesota in a sweeping ICE operation is sowing chaos, coming amid a giant welfare fraud scandal in the state. The interview highlights controversy over federal immigration enforcement and its impact on Minnesota's communities. Separately, 5 years after the January 6 attack, the White House has launched a website that places blame for the riot on police, Mike Pence, Nancy Pelosi, and others. Here is your top story for January 4th. Here is your top story for January 7th, 2026. Woman fatally shot by ICE officer in Minneapolis identified. Governor Walz demands investigation. Source: CBS News. An ICE officer fatally shot a woman Wednesday morning in South Minneapolis, and a U.S. official identified her as Renee Good. City leaders say she was a legal observer of federal actions in the city, and Governor Walz is demanding a full investigation into the shooting. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said at a news conference that the ICE officer involved had been involved in an incident with an anti-ICE rioter in June. Here is your top story for January 8, 2026. Iran's new wave of protests prompts hospital raids, internet access cut. Source: ABC News. Protests across Iran, sparked in Tehran on December 28, have stretched into their 12th day as demonstrators challenge the ruling regime. Authorities have stepped up a crackdown, with hospital raids reported and internet access cut to hinder communication. At least 36 protesters have been killed and more than 2,000 detained by regime forces. Here is your top story for January 9th, 2026. Trump says U.S. is making moves to acquire Greenland, whether they like it or not. Source: Fox News. President Donald Trump told about 24 oil executives that the United States is moving to acquire Greenland, whether they like it or not. He linked the Greenland push to national security concerns and warned that Russia and China won't move in on Venezuela or Greenland on his watch. The report frames the Greenland discussion within broader security context and notes, per the description, that it follows reports of the U.S. military's capture of Nicolás Maduro. Here is your top story for January 4th. Here is your top story for January 10th, 2026. DHS releases video showing moments before fatal ICE shooting in Minneapolis. Source: CBS News. The Department of Homeland Security posted a new video showing moments before the fatal shooting of 37-year-old Renee Good in Minneapolis. The release comes as U.S. immigration and customs enforcement operations were underway in the city. Separately, Minneapolis Public Schools said they will offer families remote learning options amid the ICE activity.